Okay, everyone, thank you all so much for attending our NWHM Presents Sundays at Home presentation of Picturing Political Power with author Allison K. Lange. My name is Liz Eberlein. I'm the Education Programs Manager at the National Women's History Museum outside of Washington, D.C. And founded in 1996, the National Women's History Museum is the nation's only women's history museum and the most recognized institution dedicated to uncovering, interpreting, and celebrating women's diverse contributions to society. A renowned leader in women's history education, the museum brings to life the countless untold stories of women throughout history, and it serves as a space for all to inspire, experience, collaborate, and amplify women's impact, past, present, and future. For nearly 25 years, we've served as the largest online cultural institution dedicated to U.S. women's history, and we're excited that in the coming years, we'll finally have a physical home of our own in Washington, D.C. In the meantime, we'll continue our important work of sharing the powerful history of women in America. And we hope that after today's discussion, you'll find us on social media and explore our website and join us in the important work of representation. A few housekeeping notes. We are recording this presentation so that it can be available on our website following the event. Allison will be answering questions at the end of her presentation. So if you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function on the toolbar at the bottom of the screen. You may ask your question at any time during the presentation, but please know that we won't be answering those questions during the presentation. We'll be answering those afterwards. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Allison K. Lange is an associate professor of history at the Wentworth Institute of Technology. She received her PhD in history from Brandeis University. Her book, Picturing Political Power, Images in the Women's Suffrage Movement, was published in May 2020 by the University of Chicago Press. The book focuses on the ways that women's rights activists and their opponents used images to define gender and power during the suffrage movement, which we'll hear about a little bit today. Various institutions have supported her work, including the National Endowment for the Humanities, Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Library of Congress, and American Antiquarian Society. Lange has presented her work at conferences such as the American Historical Association, Organization of American Historians, and Berkshire Conference of Women Historians. Her writing has appeared in Imprint, The Atlantic, and The Washington Post. She also engages in public history and has worked with us here at the National Women's History Museum and curated exhibitions for the Boston Public Library's Leventhal Map Center. In preparation for the 2020 centennial of the 19th Amendment this past August, she curated exhibitions at the Massachusetts Historical Society and Harvard Schlesinger Library. I can never pronounce that. We are thrilled that she could be with us today, so please help me welcome our author, Allison K. Lange.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Liz, and thank you so much to you and Lorianne for organizing this today. I am very excited to be here with you all virtually on this Sunday afternoon. I'm coming into you from Boston, where it is gray and a perfect day to be thinking about women's history because it's not so lovely outside today here. So I'm excited to talk with all of you today. We're specifically going to be thinking about images in the women's suffrage movement. And I think that one of the things I'd like to kind of start off with is what this word suffrage even means. It feels like a very out of date term in the 21st century. We rarely use it. But in fact, in the 19th century, people talked about suffrage pretty regularly. People talked about white male suffrage, people talked about black male suffrage, but it really is just a term for voting rights. It means the right to vote. And for some reason, over the years, it's really stuck to the women's voting rights movement in a way that it hasn't stuck as well to other movements for voting rights. So I just wanted to start off with what this even means, because when I'm talking to my students about it, it feels like suffrage has something to do with suffering or, something bigger than the right to vote. And we'll certainly be thinking more specifically about the voting rights movement in the United States today. And we are going to be looking at a lot of really wonderful historical images, or I think they're wonderful, and I hope that you will also think they're wonderful. So I am going to start us off with that. But rather than starting by thinking about history first, what I'd like to do is think about the ways that some of the really current popular images, what they have to do with the history of the women's voting rights movement. So I'm going to start us off actually with a photograph from a street somewhat near the National Women's History Museum in the DC area. This is on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, DC. So for those of you who've been there before, that's the street between the White House and the United States Capitol building. And this is a photograph from the 2017 Women's March in Washington, DC, which was the largest mass demonstration in the nation's history. And for those of you who remember these images from this particular protest, you might remember, or maybe people like me just particularly looked out for, images related to women's history. And so this is an example that really stood out to me. We have Susan B. Anthony is the woman in the front. She's the front head here with the glasses. In the background, you might also notice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's portrait, as well as Eleanor Roosevelt's portrait. And so the idea here is that not only are people protesting, for women's rights, but of course it wasn't only about women's rights, it was about a lot of other, a host of things. People are not only thinking about that current moment, but they're also thinking about the ways that women like Susan B. Anthony have done this, for many years before them. And so what I'd like to do is think about the ways that, how Susan B. Anthony got to this place of prominence, and we'll be talking about that soon. Another photograph that, this is not a current image, but I will show you the current image very shortly. This is a photograph of Inez Milholland. She's also in this photograph on Pennsylvania Avenue at a very different women's political protest, or maybe not so different, from the 1913 suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. It was the first suffrage parade in Washington, D.C., the first really national parade that they organized there. And by the time she was part of this parade, she was the herald in this parade. She wore all white. She's on a white horse. She was considered to be the most beautiful suffragist. She was certainly a spokeswoman for the movement. She was highly educated, from a very privileged family. She was actually one of the first women in the United States to earn a law degree at one of the few schools that allowed women to enter, which was NYU for her. And so she was also, not only representing this, herself, but she was a representative for the suffrage movement as a whole. And this past summer, I couldn't help but think of her when this photograph became viral on social media. Seeing this photograph of this woman named Breonna Noble riding her horse, Dapper Dan, in Oakland, California during the Black Lives Matter protests seemed to resonate with people in a way that is not so dissimilar to this earlier 1913 very famous photograph. And so when we're thinking about that, we're thinking about the ways these women were representing themselves, but also this broader history of social movements and this kind of idea of women kind of riding off to support a particular cause. And in fact, this image had become, familiar enough that it actually was integrated into a video advertisement, a commercial this past month. And so now this woman, Breonna Noble, is not only representing a political cause, a particular kind of activism, but now also representing a commercial product, which I think is really interesting to see how she's not, which is not something Inez Milholland did, as far as I know at least, but it's interesting to see how these images are used to sell particular ideas and in some cases particular things. Another image that I couldn't help, or something that really stood out to me, is the fact that this past summer, the White House, once again, this is like a longer history, became a center for protests. And one thing that is really one detail that's fascinating to me from learning about the suffragists is that the suffragists were in fact the very first group in our nation's history to protest outside the White House. And so they were picketing the White House. No one had ever done that before. They were the ones that really made the White House, the area around the White House, into a space of protest in a way that no one had ever done before. And so if you've ever been to visited Washington, D.C. and checked out the White House at some point in your life, there's always someone protesting something there. And this representation, this writing in paint on the streets about a protest this past summer was only the latest in a long century of history of the White House being this vital center for political conversations. Another thing you may have been noticing over the past several years is women wearing white, female political leaders in particular, wearing white to high-profile events, right? So this is actually from the 2020 State of the Union. And this features women who are wearing white to actually recall the suffragists. So we looked at that photograph of Inez Milholland wearing white on her horse, and that's because for a lot of suffrage parades, women wore white. And they did this, partially to kind of recall ideas of virtue and morality, these ideas of purity and things that people wanted to associate with women at that time. But they were also thinking about their photographs when they made that choice. So by the 1910s, when they are doing these parades, they are also hiring publicity professionals. And these publicity professionals know that in these black and white photographs, if these women wear white against, this various shades of gray, black background, they will stand out. And so once these photographs, these black and white photographs then get printed into a newspaper, if they're wearing white and everything else behind them is gray and black, Americans will actually be able to see these women far more clearly. And so this was actually a political strategy. I don't think necessarily that all of these women wearing this recognize that this was such a visual strategy. People wear this color today in order to, just like the Women's March image we looked at, recall that there's this longer history of women actually participating in politics, and this longer history of women leading political movements. And so this is one reason why we see a lot of white pantsuits, I'd say, why we've seen those in the past several years. And I'm going to kind of jump back in time because we have a sense of how these images are part of our conversations today, but I want to show you how we got there now. So this is from 1775. And just to put that in context for you, 1775 is the year before the Declaration of Independence. It's the early days of the American Revolution. And this is a moment when Americans are kind of still trying to figure out which direction they're going to go. And this is a mezzotint. This is a very fancy type of print by Philip Daw. And Philip Daw was an artist living in London. He probably had never been to the American colonies, probably never went in his life. But one day he probably read about the fact that women in Edenton, North Carolina had decided to get together and sign a petition to boycott tea. Okay, so his mind, he clearly imagined this scene. This is something that must have fascinated him. And so he drew an idea of what he imagined this to look like. And to an 18th century viewer, this scene is chaos. This is like a dystopian world of horror. So one of the things we have here is a woman with a gavel. She has like a very large nose and very masculine, unfeminine features. If you've seen, historical images of women, they're often idealized. They look nothing like this woman with the gavel or the woman behind her. In the background, we have a woman carrying a big bowl and she has it up to her mouth. And that is a punch bowl. And it's not fruit punch, it is alcohol. So there's a woman holding it up, and the other woman is actually like tipping it back for her. So not only are these, you know, very masculine looking women at the scene, there also is a ton of alcohol. And then on the other side, on the left, we see women pouring out their tea canisters into, they're dumping out the tea into this containers to get rid of it. All of these women, and there are many women in this room, are ignoring the child who is sitting under the table. The only thing paying attention to the child is the dog, and the dog is licking the child and urinating on a tea canister. And this is all to illustrate the fact that these women are abandoning their domestic responsibilities, their caregiving responsibilities, their children, in order to participate in politics. So this is a suggestion that if women participate in politics, they will abandon their families, right? And then the other idea that's you know, part of this image is there's a Black woman that's standing behind the woman with the gavel. She's holding out an inkwell and a quill, and she's also looking like she's pretty interested in signing and participating in this as well. And so the suggestion that Philip Daw makes is that not only are these women challenging the patriarchy, challenging, you know, the typical structure of gender in American society, there is also a challenge to the racial hierarchy in American society. So this idea of white supremacy and this idea of even the institution of slavery, right? If this Black woman is interested in joining, then both of those things might be in danger. And as you all know, slavery was really the foundations for the British Empire, you know, the economic empire that they were creating. And so this was a scene that inspired laughter from people, but it was a kind of nervous, anxious laughter, right? It was they never wanted to see this come to pass. This was intended to mock the American Revolution so that we didn't take it seriously. And so that's what we see happening in this picture. And now one of the things I have found about anti-women's rights activists is that their message, their images remain remarkably consistent over time. And in fact, I think that we could have a really fascinating discussion about whether you see these images as part of our visual culture today. Do we encounter them on social media? Do we encounter them on television or in movies? This is an image from 1851. And to give you a little bit of context for this, by 1851, women's rights activists are organizing. 1775, there's no women's rights movement happening. But by 1851, women are petitioning their local governments for rights. They've met at Seneca Falls in 1848. 1850 is when the very first National Women's Rights Convention is. So by 1851, the nation is very aware that there is a small but growing and very vocal group that wants to see women to be able to own property, to have a good education, to control their own money, and also to vote. And so this is called bloomerism in practice. So this is not only thinking about all of these property and voting rights, but also thinking about how women want to wear more freeing clothing and not just skirts and very heavy petticoats. It features Mrs. Turkey in the center of the room, and she is smoking. She's got her bloomers on, and they are showing off her ankle, which is, you know, 19th century version of quite scandalous. She has her hand really placed quite, I think, condescendingly on this man who is supposed to be her husband, but who is hunched over kind of like an old woman. He is, you know, mending clothes, doing this very menial labor here. And the mother and the father really are ignoring this crying child in the front. And the child has this banner that says, "No more Papa and Mama." So he's been abandoned because the mother is paying attention to women's rights activism over this child. In the background, we have two women. One of them, I think, is a domestic servant. She holds a sign that says "No more basement and kitchen." So this is an idea that that lower class, poorer working people will be dissatisfied with their place and challenge that class hierarchy. And there's also a Black woman who is smoking a pipe, and she is holding a sign that actually protests against slavery. And so there are a lot of different hierarchies, different cultural standards that are being challenged in this piece. And yet a lot of the same themes that were in that image that we looked at that was actually from 1775. So it's very much ingrained in our culture to see women who are in these very public positions of political leadership as masculine, as in some particular way. This is another image from 1851. I'm showing you this one because I want you to have a sense of the fact that this is not just one image that a few people saw. These are the kinds of images and themes that people saw in a variety of illustrated newspapers and magazines and prints and broadsides and all kinds of images from this time, you know, really re-emphasized, reiterated these ideas over and over and over again. These women are smoking, they have bloomers that are far too short, because when women actually wore bloomers in the 1850s, the skirts usually went down to their ankles anyway. And they have riding crops in their hands. They've got this like really masculine, aggressive looking bulldog with them. The only man in the scene, it has his back facing us. He's like fleeing, trying to get away from these masculine women. We also see two women linking arms. So the suggestion that not only do women not need men to kind of, you know, have political power anymore, they are now in romantic relationships with each other. And so this is what people are envisioning when they're thinking about women's rights activism through the 19th century. And so this image is from nearly a century after that first image I showed you, the first historical image I showed you. And this text in the front, I feel like kind of says it all. It says, "Vote for the celebrated man tamer, Susan Sharptongue." and the other theme, you know, part of this one that I think is really different is this woman on the side who has her fist raised. She is shaking her fist at this man who is probably supposed to be her husband, telling him that he must take care of the child so that she can go vote. And he looks quite horrified by this. So one of the things that's really popular in 19th century images is, you know, this father carrying a child as like a sign of the end of the world, that these women are, you know, taking over our nation. And you can imagine why suffragists, why these women's rights leaders might, in response, hope that they can change this stereotype. One of the things that allows them to do that is the rise of a new type of photograph technology in the 1850s and 60s called the carte de visite. Early photographs really only created one unique print that could not be reproduced. But by the 1850s, there's a new process called the wet plate process, and that allows them to reproduce prints over and over and over again. If you remember the days of like having film in your camera and having it developed, this is, you know, that was the like ancestor, the descendants rather of that earlier wet plate process type. And so these carte de visite are super small. You can probably blow them up any size you want on your screen, but they're very tiny. I always tell my students they're kind of like baseball cards. They're really inexpensive. You want to collect them all. You want one of your favorite actors. You want one of your, you know, the president, because otherwise you're never going to see a photograph of the president in the 1860s at least. You want one of your favorite authors. And so this is something that people were collecting. It's something that they were, you know, really excited to kind of put in their parlor in a scrapbook and gather them together. Sojourner Truth is really one of the first women's rights leaders to really think through how she wanted to present herself with a photograph like this, and take charge of distributing it too. So Sojourner Truth was born in the late 1790s in New York. She was enslaved for the first 3 decades of her life, but then she was able to leave slavery. It was outlawed in New York State, and she was able to become a really quite famous lecturer for anti-slavery and women's rights activism. So she became quite famous within reform networks. And so in the 1860s, she decided to sit for her photograph. And this is one of many that are quite similar that she sat for. And it shows her wearing a fairly simple Quaker style clothing. And I say it's simple because in comparison to other 19th century women's clothes, it is. And she's also knitting, a very feminine domestic task. She has a vase of flowers next to her, a book on this table, all the kind of suggest a very domestic scene. And it says on the bottom, I sell the shadow to support the substance. In the 19th century, Americans needed to expose their photographs using sunlight. That was absolutely necessary to make these photographs possible. So photographs were sometimes called shadows. So she was selling the shadow to support the substance herself, but also these really important substantial reforms that she was trying to make possible. So she was a working reformer. She wasn't, a lot of women had family money, but she really depended on her lecture fees, raising money by selling this photograph, raising money by selling her autobiography in order to survive. And she did quite well. She ended up purchasing land in Michigan and building a quite large home for herself and her extended family. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton saw what Sojourner Truth was doing, and they must have been quite intrigued by it. They must have decided that, having an image and kind of responding to these political cartoons that they've been seeing over and over again was a really valuable thing to do. And so in 1870, they went to Napoleon Serony's studio in New York City and sat for this photograph. You can see that they have a very different approach from Sojourner Truth. They don't kind of suggest that they're these domestic figures at all. And in fact, it really was unusual for women to take a photograph together either. You most often exchange photographs among your friends. So they're really capturing themselves as leaders of a movement in this picture. They are wearing far more frivolous, not frivolous, but decorative. Their clothing is clearly far more expensive than Sojourner Truth's clothing. There's jewelry, Elizabeth Cady Stanton with her white hair, she has this like black lace mantilla flowing over her, flowing from the headpiece. And we can see the expression on their face is also far more aggressive, right? They feel empowered to kind of be more defiant in their image than a Black woman like Sojourner Truth, who's trying to represent herself as this, respectable, refined figure. They don't have to kind of create the same image as white women. And so this really captures them at a moment when they have just founded the very first National Women's Suffrage Association. And they've also just started publishing a newspaper called The Revolution. So not really a subtle pair at all. And anti-women's rights cartoons do change a little bit in response to the fact that these women's faces become more popular. This is an illustration from 1873, and you can see that the artist directly copied that earlier 1870 photograph. This is an image of Susan B. Anthony standing hand on hip. Her skirt, again, is far too short. And instead of this time revealing her ankles, it actually shows boots with spurs on them. She's got her umbrella next to her, and she's holding it kind of the way a military officer might hold a sword. In the background, we've got a very large group of women protesting, but this is 1873. Women are not protesting and having big rallies like this. This is an imagined scene. There's also a female police officer. And on the right side, we have yet again a man carrying a baby and another man carrying the day's groceries. So this idea that this world is turned upside down, that if women are taking on these tasks, that men will be forced to take on these domestic feminine tasks. And, you know, isn't that a horrible thing, according to this artist? The other thing that I've noticed about this one is that Susan B. Anthony actually had an eye issue, which is often why she sat for photographs in profile, which is what we have on our dollar coin. But this artist decided to actually reproduce that eye issue in this engraving. And if you look really closely, you can see that here, which just gives you a sense at how interested this image was into kind of attacking Anthony, not only for her political views, but also personally. But the suffragists really just wanted to be seen like these men, right? This is a very familiar image of a man in power, a president in power, that I think we can all imagine, you know, George Washington on our dollar bill. And, you know, we've seen images like this for our entire life. And this is what they really wanted to look like. So this is from 1881. This is from the History of Women's Suffrage, which is really the very first major public image project that the suffragists launch. And this is a book that was, you know, there are 6 volumes of this series. Each volume is about 1,000 pages long and has several portraits of women that the editors chose to represent them. Matilda Jocelyn Gage, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony were the editors of the first couple of volumes, and they chose who they wanted to represent them. Of course, they chose themselves. They wanted us to make sure we remembered them, but they really focused on women who were in their same organization, the National Women's Suffrage Association. They didn't choose women, they didn't choose to emphasize women who were part of the competing, much larger organization called the American Women's Suffrage Association. They also really focused on white women. Despite the fact that Susan B. Anthony had Sojourner Truth's portrait, you know, interacted with Sojourner Truth, they wrote to each other, they saw each other at various events, they decided not to include any women of color or men of color in the history of women's suffrage. So it's a very particular idea of who a suffragist is. The other thing that is excluded from the history of women's suffrage is a lot of information about male suffragists. Because as you can guess, it's the 19th century, who's voting? Men. Who's holding political office? Men. Male allies were incredibly important to help this movement move forward. So this particular set, you know, the history of women's suffrage really presented a very specific idea of who a suffragist was, and they really influenced who we still think of today, like Susan B. Anthony. This is yet another, you know, a stereotype of women's rights activism, you know, just to remind you that things aren't changing that much in anti-women's rights imagery. This is have dinner at one deer. So it's a woman who's leaving, wearing bloomers with a bike. You know, there's a man standing there doing laundry. He has to watch the children, and now he has to make dinner. This is what these new women are doing in the late 19th century. By the late 19th century also, women's suffrage organizations, they finally unify in 1890, and they decided to create national press committees with state committees and local committees, very much coordinating a movement. They found a national publishing company for themselves, a women's suffrage publishing company, so they can print their own materials. Fortunately, a lot of women are starting to be accepted into art schools by the late 19th century. So they now have a host of female artists who are creating images. You know, all the images that we were looking at previously, those were, you know, made by men. They were printed by men, published by men, for magazines edited by men. And so there's a real shift that we see in the late 19th century towards a new kind of campaign that suffragists are launching. And by the 1910s, this campaign really reaches its height. And this is an illustration by Blanche Ames, who was a Boston suffragist. She entitled this one, "Double the Power of the Home. 2 good votes are better than 1." And so this scene really kind of captures what she and many of the National American Women's Suffrage Association members would have envisioned as what a good suffragist looks like. It's a white woman. She's sitting down in her house. She has 3 small children around her. It's a really like perfectly kept home. It has a "God bless our home" sign on the wall. There's a tea kettle on the stove steaming away. And so this is really this, perfect, idyllic scene of who should vote in the United States. And so the idea is also kind of implicit in this, this woman is from a wealthy enough family that, she's not being required to work. She can stay home with her children. And so this is the kind of woman that suffragists are supposedly fighting for to win the vote. And you can see that this is a direct challenge to the many decades of anti-women's rights cartoons that these suffragists encountered, right? So instead of the vote actually making women masculine, they are arguing that the vote will make women better mothers. So they've really turned that argument on its head. This is a poster by Rose O'Neill. It says, "Give mother the vote. We need it. These children need it." Perhaps you might find these children familiar. This is by the same artist who created the Cupid doll. And so the idea is that mothers should have a vote, should have a say in children's food, their health, their play, their schools, etc., and that this will make them, in fact, better caregivers. Many suffrage arguments weren't necessarily about equality, but by the 1910s, they were often about becoming better mothers. And the stereotype of suffragists was changing by the 1910s too. On the one side, we have here a woman wearing like fairly frumpy, unfashionable clothing. And on the other side, we have this woman wearing an enormous hat, elegant high-heeled shoes with, a perfect silhouette here as well. And you can see that this is a representation of, the Gibson girl ideal from this time. So instead of suffragists looking like this frumpier woman, they now look like this idealized woman. But not all women really fit into that type. And this is a portrait of Mary Church Terrell. Terrell was actually one of the first Black women in the United States to earn an undergraduate degree. And she became the first president of the National Association of Colored Women, which was founded in 1896. And she could have been a member and could have stuck with the National American Women's Suffrage Association. But by the 1896, Black women and people across the country are seeing the fact that that year is the same year that Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court case, is agreed upon. And that's the Supreme Court case that decides that segregation is legal. In the 1890s, beginning with the Mississippi State Constitution changes in 1890, the states across the South are disenfranchising Black men, adding new requirements like literacy tests and poll taxes and grandfather clauses that prevent them from voting. This is also a moment where there's an uptick in violence against Black people in general. And so it's not only about the vote for Mary Church Terrell and many of the members of the National Association of Colored Women. They are envisioning a far broader equal rights campaign that certainly includes women's voting rights, but also, quite frankly, includes Black men's voting rights. So they are, Terrell is fascinating because she tries to emphasize that that she is a suffragist as well. And she distributes her portrait quite widely. This is one portrait from a bulletin to one of her talks. And you can see that it's quite similar to this idealized vision of a new Negro woman published around the same time. So she really thought it was very important to represent herself as an elegant, refined, respectable woman at this time, to be that, ideal, beautiful Black suffragist that she wanted to be. And this is very much in order to challenge racist stereotypes in cartoons that were popular at this time. This is actually a program from the 1913 parade, which is where Inez Milholland marched as the herald here. And Inez Milholland played a really significant role in that parade, not only as the herald, but also because she helped convince the organizers that Black women should march in that parade. Mary Church Terrell marched in that parade. Ida B. Wells marched in that parade. So did a Black sorority from Howard University called Delta Sigma Theta. And so this was a moment of coming together in some ways, and yet there was significant resistance to that. And I want to show you this racist cartoon really quickly, just to give you a sense of the racism that Mary Church Terrell and many of her fellow suffragists faced. This is a cartoon that's making fun of the white suffragists for not wanting the Black suffragists to march with them, but it's also lampooning these Black suffragists. It's exaggerating their facial features. It's suggesting that they are not wearing fashionable clothing, that they don't it very much looks like the stereotypes of suffragists from past images that we looked like. And while all of the images that I've shown you so far are very popular pictures, ones that people encountered over and over and over again throughout the 19th and into the early 20th century, this one's unusual, and I want to point it out to you. This is the only one that I found in my many years of suffrage research that really emphasized that Black women need the vote because they're good mothers. And this was published by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. And that organization printed this in their magazine, which was called The Crisis, but it also printed it separately as a poster, which is what we're looking at here. And we see a woman who has a bat labeled Federal Constitution, and she is trying to hit down segregation, Jim Crow laws, and grandfather clauses in order to protect the two children who are in her skirts. And so the National American Women's Suffrage Association, this white women-led organization, never included Black women, women of color more broadly, into their propaganda. So this is a really unusual piece. It's called the South's Battalion of Death: What Votes for Women Means to the South. And there was this widespread fear, not only in the South, but especially in the South, that if women won the right to vote, that Black women would win the right to vote, and they would dismantle this system of systemic racism that was being put into place, like segregation, the Jim Crow laws, and grandfather clauses that we see here. And one of the things that is also part of this moment is, in both of these kind of pro-suffrage images, women are striving to take care of their families, and same with the images by Bland James and Rose O'Neill that we looked at a moment ago. And one of the things that really reinforces this idea of women as caregivers in service to a greater good is something that happens in 1917, which is the United States enters World War I. And so there are a ton of posters like this one emphasizing women as vital, patriotic caregivers in this moment. And so this is called The Greatest Mother in the World. She is kind of like a very much a Virgin Mary and child kind of Christian imagery, if you're familiar with that as well. And so this is this idea that women are contributing to American society, acting as patriotic citizens by caring for others. And one thing that a lot of suffrage historians haven't yet thought about, but I think we're all thinking about now, is the fact that in 1918, the flu pandemic breaks out. And so September 30th, 1918, Woodrow Wilson actually addresses the Senate and tries to convince them to pass the 19th Amendment. They don't do it then, and within the week, the United States Capitol really is hit by the flu pandemic. The many leaders of Congress actually fall ill. They have to close the public galleries in the House of Representatives. This is a lot of things that perhaps we're familiar with in our own pandemic moment. And so they actually don't end up passing the 19th Amendment until the spring of the following year. And we can imagine why it took so long. But I think one of the things that perhaps convinced, a lot of these public figures to pass this amendment is that not only were women, contributing during World War I, acting as these important, vital partners in this war, but also Americans, at a very local level, saw that women were acting as nurses professionally, but also more informally within their communities and within their homes. And I think that that was something that ultimately also helped women be seen as these important contributors to American society. So as we close out, I want to remind you to vote. You can't study the history of voting rights in the United States and not be very excited about having the opportunity to vote. One of the things that I find really fascinating is, if the vote were not an important thing, it would not have, that many people would not have worked to try and prevent women from having access to it. So the vote is a powerful thing, and I hope you have the opportunity to take advantage of that this fall. And if you're interested in learning more about these images and many, many, many more, you're welcome to check out my book. And if you are interested, you can buy it from your local bookstore. You can buy it on Amazon. You can also buy it from the University of Chicago Press website. And if you do that, if you use the code UCPNEW, you can actually get it for 20% off. So that is my tip for today, UCPNEW at the University of Chicago Press website. So I'm excited to hear your questions today. I am happy to go back to different images. I'm happy to talk about things that really stood out to you and answer your questions. I'm delighted to see what you all think on this lovely Sunday afternoon.
And thank you, Allison, so much for being with us and doing the presentation. Again, everyone, if you are interested in asking a question and having that answered today, please use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen to ask the question. Looks like we just had something pop up, and it was just, this was fascinating. She doesn't have a question, but she just wants to say thanks for sharing your education with everyone, that it was so much fun to learn. So again, thank you for doing that. I did want to also briefly mention, Allison mentioned Inez Milholland during the presentation. We did screen 2 different short films for the centennial, Into Light and Forward Into Light as well. And we did have a panel discussion with those filmmakers that are available on our website if you're interested in learning a little bit more about Inez Milholland on the website as well. And yes, Bonnie, the recording will be available sometime this week. We did record, so it'll be available sometime within the next few days on the womenshistory.org website. So please be on the lookout for that for future reference as well. So again, do we have any questions? We have a few more minutes. We have a question. Can you talk a little bit more about the history of voter suppression?
Sure. I think we think about history of voter suppression, maybe we think about conversations we're having right now. But when we think about this longer history of voting rights, I think it is easy to think about this just like story of expansion of voting rights in the United States. And in many ways that feels true. On the other hand, there have been over the course of United States history, because there have been changes. It's not just this one arc towards more people can vote. So one of the things that I think is really important to start with is the fact that the Constitution guarantees no one's right to vote. It's actually only states that decide who can vote. And so all of these voting laws vary state by state. They did in the past and they do today. In fact, women were voting in New Jersey in the 1790s into 1808. And that they were actually, along with Black men, disenfranchised in 1808. because they didn't, the state of New Jersey decided they actually didn't want them to vote. So there's, an example of a, voter suppression very early on, perhaps not at a moment we're thinking of. And so when we're thinking about this, the history of voting rights in the United States is a constant debate. It's been constantly, questioned who should vote in the United States. The 19th Amendment, it seems like a really lovely place to end. Women were guaranteed the right to vote is often a line we see. But as I'm sure everyone at the National Women's History Museum is well aware, the 19th Amendment didn't guarantee anyone the right to vote. And many women could not vote long after the passage of the 19th Amendment. For example, Native American women, many couldn't gain citizenship until 1924, and some even later. Puerto Rican women didn't gain the right to vote until the end of the 1920s. Asian American women didn't vote until the 1940s. Black women in the South were still facing poll taxes and literacy tests and things that were put into place in the 1890s, when we have this kind of like really early wave of voter suppression. So this is a story we're still debating today. It's just cloaked in different language. It's just cloaked in language of voter ID laws and whether absentee ballots are safe. It's discussions of whether felons can vote and that sort of thing. Even if it's slightly different conversations, it's very much the same ideas that suffragists were thinking about a century ago.
Wonderful. And do you have any images that were your favorite, or any images that you found the most surprising when doing that you came across or in doing the research of your book?
I mean, one of the ones that stood out to me, of course, is the women picketing the White House in 1917. That's the one that really drew me to this book topic, because, and if you're interested, there's a Library of Congress collection called Women of Protest that is freely accessible. And it's a collection of these women, of National Women's Party protests from the late 1910s. And it fascinated me that Alice Paul and her group decided to hire a professional photographer to go be there, to take these pictures, to kind of imagine how they wanted to look at these pictures. And that's really where this started, because I realized there was just a lot more purpose. There was a lot more strategy to these images than we had ever really thought about before.
Kind of an interesting, funny question. Most of the cartoons that you showed have a dog in them. The one with the good mother has a cat. Is there anything really symbolic on the use of the dog or the cat in those images?
I think it depends, right? So like the cat in the image that you're referring to is like this like cozy cat, perhaps like your own cat. And it's suggestion of this like very like well-mannered, perfect household. And this is, whereas the dogs in other earlier cartoons are these often like these aggressive creatures that are acting out of order, urinating on, tea canisters and things. And so I think that matters more than the pet itself. In fact, there are anti-suffrage cartoons that depict suffragists as cats, as these, touchy creatures that are acting poorly in response as part of their protest. So yeah, I think that the animals matter, but I think maybe in these particular cartoons, it matters more what they're doing than the animal that they are.
And how significant was the issue of race to the strategy in the early 20th century?
That's a really important question. And I would argue that it was quite significant, because the suffragists were thinking about it not only implicitly, but very explicitly. Suffragists realized of the National American Women Suffrage Association, so the white-led organization, they realized that if they highlight Black women on their propaganda, if they highlight Native American women or Chinese women on their propaganda, that they think that they will lose supporters. That's not gonna, in their minds, that's not going to win over voters and cause people to support their cause. And so that's ultimately their strategy. So they are actually never fighting for the vote for women of color. They're quite implicitly fighting for the vote for white women, because those are the women they're featuring in their imagery over and over again. Those are the spokeswomen for the movement. You know, Alice Paul and Mary Church Terrell. Mary Church Terrell actually pickets the White House with Alice Paul and her National Women's Party. But after the passage of the 19th Amendment, you know, Mary Church Terrell writes Alice Paul and says, okay, you know, we've got this 19th Amendment. Let's make sure it's enforced. Let's make sure that women are able to vote across the country. And Alice Paul says, not my problem. This is one of the most infuriating letters I have maybe ever read in my life. She basically says, it's not my problem. That's a race issue, and that has nothing to do with women's right to vote. So they're very aware that race is at play here, and they are, white women are using it to win the vote for themselves, and very much leaving behind a lot of women of color. And that divide, that fracture that we saw then, is still very much part of conversations about feminism today.
Wonderful. So I think we have time for maybe one, maybe two more questions. So we have a question that I find to be also very interesting is, when do you first see the concept of branding, as in like the sash, the colors of the suffrage movement, the banners, the pins, and all of that? When do you first see that kind of coming into play?
I really see that coming into play starting in 1898. That's when that's of course the 50th anniversary of the Seneca Falls convention. And that's when suffragists are starting to experiment with like symbols to represent their movement. And they adopt a sunflower with 1848 written in it. And that yellow color, which is related to Kansas being the sunflower state, and where one of the early places where women won the right to vote in city elections, that color yellow becomes a really popular suffrage color, in addition to white, which we already discussed. And that sunflower really remains popular symbol of suffrage through the end of the movement. So it's maybe earlier than we might expect.
And I think kind of one final question here. I apologize. We had so many come in. They're wonderful. We don't have time to get to all of them, but one final question is, can you comment on how any parallels you see between how suffragists were depicted in the 19th century versus how women in politics and or power are depicted in today's media sources?
I think that's a really important question. So one of the things that we see is the ways that women in power are choosing to portray themselves. One example that I thought was really interesting, as we know, suffragists really emphasize their motherhood, their emphasis as caregivers. And very soon after Kamala Harris accepted the vice presidential nomination, earlier this summer, I can't even tell, I don't even know when it was now, all the time all blurs together. But one of the things she did was introduce herself and kind of quickly refer to herself as Mamala. And I think that as someone who actually doesn't have children of her own, that clearly felt like an important thing to do to kind of emphasize her status as a caregiver, and that being something that's very important to her life. So that's a real connection that we can see between the ways women chose to represent themselves in the past and the ways women choose to represent themselves now. I think that one thing that is the same, which I kind of hinted to throughout the piece, is that a lot of people who oppose women in these positions of power often say the same things about, women being man tamers. When Hillary Clinton ran for president, there was a nutcracker figure of her. And it's nothing new and innovative. It's the same old thing. And in fact, even at the Women's March in 2017, there was a New York Times article about what were the men going to do when the women were away? And that feels very, very old. And that the author rightly got a lot of feedback for that piece. But but these things are still very much part of our culture today.
And again, I apologize, everybody. We do still have many more questions. We unfortunately don't have time. If you are interested in asking those questions still, please feel free to send us an email at history@womenshistory.org. We'll do our best to answer those questions that we weren't able to get to today. But Allison, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to kind of talk to us about these images and this very important topic that we've continued to hear about, especially with the election coming up. So thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you everybody for being here, asking such wonderful questions. We hope to see you at other programs that we have coming up. And again, thank you all so much, and we hope to see you soon. So thank you.